Hello, warm welcome to you all. My name is Hanco Jürgens from the Duitsland Instituut. And I'm very glad that you're all here despite the strike of the Dutch railway and the other strikes which were announced. But, well, we are glad that we can have this presentation of this highly relevant topical book. It's a joyful read, a good read, compact book on a very broad theme. And it makes you think about many topics on European history while reading. And certainly today, individual freedom is at stake again. So, well, it's an important topic to think about. It's a very unique book because one would think that it's part of a history of concepts. One would expect perhaps something about Reinhard Koselleck or Quentin Skinner. They're not mentioned in the book at all. So it is really a book which fits very well in the oeuvre of Moritz Föllmer. Don't expect too many philosophers. No Heidegger, no Habermas, although in the footnotes perhaps, okay. But no Heidegger and Habermas, whereas they are perhaps might be important when you would think about individual freedom. But it is a history of individual freedom in, well, in a thinking by ordinary men and women, so to speak. It's an everyday life history. And instead of Heidegger and Habermas, you will find, for example, Astrid Lindgren with Pippi Langstocking, or Tintin in, where is it? In Congo, in the Congo. Sorry?
I took that from this.
You took that from this, yes. So it's more or less a social history of ideas, gender relations, and of the dynamics of possible changes and constraints. According to Moritz Föllmer, there is no linear story of liberal continuities. Instead, there are many paradoxes, frustrations, and unforeseen changes. And with its wide scope, I said it already, it suits very well in the oeuvre of Moritz Föllmer, who is an associate professor of modern history at the University of Amsterdam. He joined our department in 2011. And he came from the University of Leeds. And among his really many publications, I only call his recent publications on individuality in Berlin, Self and Society from Weimar to the Wall, Cambridge University Press 2013, Culture in the Third Reich, Oxford University Press 2020, and together with Pamela Sweat, the edited volume on Reshaping Capitalism in Weimar and Nazi Germany, Cambridge University 2022, and today this book. And we have the best panelists we could hope for. Also specialists in the history of daily life, material culture. First of all, Willemijn Ruberg, Associate Professor of Cultural History and Head of the Cultural History Group at Utrecht University. Among other publications, she published A History of the Body at Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. And she's co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the History of the Modern Body, which will appear in 2027, if I'm well informed. Also, we have a distinguished guest, Josephine Hoegaerts, who is Professor of European Culture after 1800 at the University of Amsterdam, a member of the European Studies Group, and she explores the histories of speech and sound in modern democracies. Between 2018 and 2023, she led the research project Vocal Articulations of Parliamentary Identity and Empire, which is, I think, a European research grant. And in 2023, she published the edited volume together with Janice Schröder, Ordinary Oralities, Everyday Voices in History at the Gruyter. So a lot about ordinary men and women, everyday culture. And we will have first an introduction of Moritz. After that, the two commentators will give their comments. We will have a short discussion and there will be Q&As. Moritz Föllmer.
Yeah, thanks for coming out, and thanks to everyone who is present online. And I'm also very grateful to Hanco and the DIA for organizing this event, to you for sharing, and for a long-standing collaboration in various forms. I'd also like to thank Josephine and Willemijn and look forward to your comments, and thanks for taking the time. And Willemijn also is one of the very few people who read the manuscript in its entirety before I sent it off to the publisher and discussed it with me on long COVID period walks in the Vondelpark. And for discussions of individual freedom, what that might mean, I'd like to thank Siobhan Airy and Bart-Jan Roffel, actually, and also both of them helpfully inquired about progress every now and then. So last person to thank, so I keep these short, is Matthijs Lok, who initially suggested that we do something like this and was then quite happy to be in the audience, and now he's grounded in Groningen. And Matthijs said, because he's very experienced in these kind of situations, so he said, tell people why you wrote the books, that's what they want to hear. So, and the problem with that is that at some point it becomes a little hazy. Why you actually wrote the book, why you ever took on, you forgot about some of the pain in writing that, but your initial, why did you ever undertake that, becomes a little difficult to actually kind of identify for yourself and then convey to others. So I say something about, I think the last book I actually read for this project, and it was a kind of a lengthy German book on Bulgarian society and its transformation under communism. And sometimes, I think on page 547, if my footnote is correct, I came across a quotation by a woman. And this was a woman who was was coping with a dual burden, which is often sort of, was a reality for women in the Eastern Bloc, that they worked, in her case, in some office, to a much larger extent than in Western Europe, but also had a very heavy kind of domestic burden of domestic labor. And commenting on her week, she exclaimed, "If that's what freedom is, then I wish it on whoever invented it." So I think that says a lot about my motivation, because I started with a sort of a very kind of strong curiosity about 20th century Europeans in different countries, from Spain all the way to Bulgaria, via Sweden, with a lot in between, under different political systems and very different social classes, both men and women. And I was very interested in what they understood by freedom and individuality, and what place these notions had in their lives, if any. And so that's sort of a diversity that continued to fascinate me. And I was also simply very keen on doing lots of reading, because there's a wealth of historiography out there, far more in social and cultural history, that has appeared in the last decades. There are great journals, great people who author articles, and people who edit these journals. It's an often unacknowledged work. And books, which I actually conservatively prefer to read cover to cover. And though that was really a great pleasure to engage with this historiography. And sometimes it yielded mere glimpse into these lives, as with this Bulgarian woman about whom we know very little. She was quoted in some kind of survey about life in 1960s Bulgaria. And sometimes I was able to consult primary sources to include short biographical sketches. You mentioned Astrid Lindgren. That is one of the, of course, a bit more documented person due to her prominence. So I've had this interest for quite some time, and I pursued it in more specific context, published some article, and I always wanted to write the book from this angle on 20th century Europe, which was, of course, an ambitious idea. And my problem was that this interest and curiosity didn't really amount to a plan. I couldn't just collect these statements and utterances, kind of mix them together and give everything a good steer. That's not really a book plan, right? And I needed a bit more of a framework than just say freedom was whatever various Europeans understood by it. But then again, I also didn't want to adopt too narrow a definition. I'm not a philosopher. That's not my task to say this counts as freedom, this is somehow not included. There's also interesting discussions. I've read some of them, but it's simply not how I see my task as a historian. So I didn't want to define away precisely this diversity that interested me in the first place. So that's why it took me years, during which time I did various other things, before I thought, okay, maybe this could work. Maybe I have a plan now, and maybe I can really embark on the project and see the chapters in the back of my mind and start reading towards certain chapters, start writing up. So that was sometimes in 2018, and it occurred to me that a lot of people tend to define individual freedom negatively against whatever they are or feel hampered by. Though there is a famous concept of actually, one philosopher I do include, Isaiah Berlin. And in the 1950s, he coined and promoted this concept of negative freedom. Negative as opposed to positive freedom. Freedom from something as opposed to freedom to do something. And this was a Cold War liberal concept. As such, it's been criticized a lot, also simply historicized, placed in its contemporary context. Berlin was chiefly demarcating freedom from both National Socialism and communism. And in my view, the limitation is less the concept of negative freedom as such, but more the fact that Isaiah Berlin defined it principally against state power and ideological engulfment. So that's the Cold War liberalism, the anti-totalitarianism of that concept. My idea was to pluralize it in a way so as to capture that 20th century Europeans were and or felt hampered by certain political regimes and ideologies, to be sure. That's an important dimension, but also by structures. Think of factory discipline, for instance. Factory discipline constrained a lot of people, kind of regimented them, but then again, mass unemployment is in a way also a structure or dependence on domestic labor that possibly limited people even more, which is why a lot of them migrated towards industrial labor in the absence of better options. Or think of gender roles, of moral conventions that are, in a sense, also something that people can feel hampered by. Or Europe, for that matter. Is Europe something that attracts, that offers a promise of freedom, particularly to those who didn't have access to it? Think of the countries that were still limited by visa or work visa regulations in the 1990s. What it meant for them to have full mobility, to be able to settle where they wanted, and think of those who are still excluded by that. Or is it constraining itself, Europe? So think of this long debate on whether America is a freer country than Europe. The long set runs all through the 20th century. Whether or not is that really freedom, which the Americans enjoy to a larger extent, or is it conformism? Is it the opposite of freedom? That's really been an important debate. Or are the colonies, were they not a space for a lot of Europeans who moved to these colonies, who worked there, settled there, felt freer than in some dusty office in Paris, London, or indeed The Hague? Though this broad range also points to very different political versions of individual freedom. And my point here is that in the 20th century, liberalism was not the only, and in my view, not even the predominant ideology that promoted it. So did others. Social Democrats tended to argue that the welfare state freed working class people from being dependent on the capitalist economy, from being dependent on family support. So it's no accident that Social Democratic Sweden was one of the first country, I believe, to adopt no-fault divorce. And various left-wingers. Communists in the early stages of their rule typically tended to argue that, in a way, they liberated people from bourgeois morality in the 1920s in the Soviet Union, or in the early East Germany, for instance, after the Second World War, free people from authoritarianism in the educational system, from, of course, the capitalist economy. Or think of social movements in the aftermath of 1968, feminism, second wave feminism, for instance. But also, I'm afraid, right-wingers. So it's a big bracket to open, so I'm going to keep it short. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. But I think the Nazis promised to free their followers from bureaucratic constraints, from the system of the Weimar Republic, from moral boundaries, from limitations on their consumption. We can, of course, normatively say that's not freedom, that's unfreedom, and that's certainly true for many of Nazis' victims and the societies they oppressed. But for their followers, we have to take seriously as historians that their followers might have seen it differently. So what's the story? It's a story of a conflict-ridden expansion, to a sense. More and more Europeans, and indeed some or quite a few colonized subjects as well, so anti-colonial intellectuals, for instance, claimed individual freedom against a whole range of obstacles and restrictions, and sometimes against all odds. They strove to expand the control over their lives, to carve out a space for themselves, to live autonomously according to their own preferred understanding. And there's a tension between these sort of low-level efforts by quite, unprominent people, and these sometimes very ambitious or even existential visions of individual freedom, usually insisting that they're separate, that whatever version they promoted didn't kind of transcended that contradiction or that tension between individual and collective freedom. Ultimately, however, the stubborn pursuit of personal preferences without much regard for any ideological agenda proved impossible to suppress or even steer in the long term. From the 1950s, various political and moral regimes gradually adapted to these more mundane versions of individual freedom. In Western Europe, obviously, the capitalist societies of the 50s and 60s, also the strongly Catholic countries loosened up. Italy, for instance, is a case in point. Also in communist Eastern Europe, where fewer demands were placed on people's commitment, and, for instance, also in Spain under the Franco dictatorship. When the communist regime suddenly fell in 1989, 1990, it seemed as though negative freedoms had, in the plural, had lost their importance in the absence of serious constraints on the lives of Europeans. Can we learn anything from this history? Is this history of more than purely historical value? As one thing I didn't want to do, because there's now, of course, a considerable gap that separates us from the 1990s. That's 3 decades, after all, by now. And I didn't just want write some kind of extended epilogue, because that would have meant ending the book with a sharp decline in quality, because the literature that I was dependent on is simply not there as yet, the historical literature for the early 21st century. But still, let me offer one observation. If it's true that Europeans have so often defined individual freedom against whatever they experience as a restriction, then that means that they were and still are often unaware of the importance of, for instance, constitutional safeguards that underpin this freedom. And it's thus easy to see how the quest for individual freedom can feed into populism. If you can say, of course, to someone normatively, look here, just because you feel impeded in your capacity as a car driver, for instance, doesn't mean you live under a dictatorship. Do you even know what a dictatorship is? But sociologically, we have to take that seriously, that sentiment, and also acknowledge that it can be fairly widespread. Think of the COVID years. 2 sociologists have published a book on populism in Germany by the, in my view, very apt title, Gekränkte Freiheit, Offended Freedom. These people who are constantly offended because they feel restricted in their freedom. So to conclude, individual freedom continues to have different meanings for different people, but Europeans, whatever they mean by it, are currently rediscovering a fundamental 20th century insight that it cannot be taken for granted. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm really happy to be here. As Moritz already told you, I've witnessed the birth of this book in its several shapes and forms. So I first like to congratulate Moritz on a beautifully and elegantly written book that I've read with much pleasure. It's also been remarked by Hanco that it's concise, which says more about us, that we really appreciate it, that it's concise. Anyway, I think I like your book mostly because for me it has a very humane and compassionate approach, paying attention to ordinary people's quest for freedom, individual freedom, as you state, and also as you've just stated, in often adverse circumstances, and that's a euphemism when we talk about concentration camps, etc. I know, because I've seen you working on this book, that there's a certain implicit methodology behind this book. You've actively chosen to include different kinds of people in every single chapter. Women, men, you have a chapter on colonialism, migrants, homosexuals, farmers, factory workers. And I remember that during the process of research and writing, how much care you spent about selecting appropriate individuals to quote. And you found them, for instance, the Italian gay film director Pier Paolo Pasolini, and she's already been mentioned, the Swedish author of children's book Astrid Lindgren. You also took care that many different European countries, also from Eastern Europe, smaller ones, were all represented. And I really appreciate it, and I've called it for myself an inclusive approach, which you don't mention anywhere, but I know that it's been one of your implicit kind of methods. My comments and questions revolve around my interest to kind of place this book a bit more in the historiography and question a bit more the theory and methodology behind it. You've already said a bit about it. Also, in order to help assess the impact this book might have on future historiography. So my first question or theme is slightly annoying because I personally hate people who start talking about definitions, but I will. You obviously in your introduction, and you've already said a bit about it, but you state in your introduction that individual freedom, the central concept of your book, lies at the intersection of the notions of freedom and individuality. That the duality of negative and positive sides can be captured by approaching individual freedom as a matter of claims, not as a stable condition, and that claims engender important effects. Interestingly, for the real definitions, one has to go to the footnotes, and that's because you are a bit reluctant to elaborate on theory, methodology, definitions. I know that you've read all the philosophy, but you really want this to be a readable book. But once one goes into these footnotes, you can find, for example, in footnote 14, you say that my approach entails the occasional use of agency, but differs from how historians have tended to employ the concept, namely as a universal human quality whose relationship to structural change is somewhat unclear. So agency goes kind of, it's not that interesting for you. You do mention German sociologist Niklas Luhmann and his notions of Anspruchsindividualität, and that's what you build on, so that you find that helpful. You argue against Foucault, and especially his idea that the modern individual was a product of disciplinary power. You focus much more on, say, individual freedom and claims to individual freedom as an active process. So, and then this is more of a question, and maybe you can answer it later. But what struck me is in the introduction that you both discuss individual freedom and the modern individual, and these two kind of slip into each other sometimes a little bit. And I wonder if individual freedom and the modern individual are the same, or the modern free individual. And it reminded me a lot of the book by historian Dror Warman, who wrote this beautiful book, The Making of the Modern Self, Identity and Culture in 18th Century England. It was published in 2004. And I think this book is relevant here for two reasons. Worman argues that the modern self, the thinking about the modern individual, has a core inner identity and is different from others, in short, who has an individual identity rather than an identity that's collectively defined, is invented, sort of, in the late 18th century. And Worman argues that during the 19th century, individual identities become anchored in nature, such as a gender identity, which becomes fixed in the body. So here is a rise of the modern individual, significantly earlier than you discuss it. So I'm interested in kind of how you think individual freedom and the modern free individual, how these relate to each other. Perhaps more importantly, Worman, who is a cultural historian himself, aims to strengthen the cultural historical method by criticizing what he calls weak collage. That's a concept of his. And that's the practice of most cultural historians, to group together a limited number of significant quotes, rather than either gathering a representative body of sources or really testing their own hypotheses. And thinking or starting from this particular book, I had a few questions that might, we can discuss them in the question, the Q&A, or later in the discussion. So if the notion of the modern free individual is equally important as the notion of individual freedom, then why would this history only start around 1900, as you do? I know, for example, that you've read cultural historian Lynn Hunt's latest book, The Revolutionary Self, Social Change and the Emergence of the Modern Individual, 1770-1800, is been published. It was published, I think, 1 or 2 months ago. I haven't read it yet, but I know you have. Hunt refers to the French Revolution as the era giving birth to the modern individual. So how does your book compare to those books on the rise of the modern individual in an earlier period, late 18th century, maybe 19th century? And to what extent does that have to do with kind of claims to individual freedom? And in terms of method, other question, I've qualified your method as inclusive and humane and compassionate. But I wonder what you see as, you yourself see as what your method has been. What have your criteria been for selecting the characters and quote you've so carefully chosen? And I'm not even primarily asking about representativeness because I don't find it that interesting, but I'm interested in how you think we as historians, cultural historians, can study individual freedom as an idea, as a practice, as both. You have consciously chosen to study what you call ordinary Europeans, but I think you focus on, say, explicitly expressed thoughts on individual freedoms and claims to these freedoms. Are there not many other implicit practices that might tell us something about individual freedom? And can you envision other types of approaches and methods to analyze individual freedom? Which leads me to my last and connected remark. I'm genuinely curious as to whether your aim has been to make an impact on the historiography, and also if you can see follow-up studies by either yourself or others tackling this idea or practice of individual freedom. So would you like this theme to be continued, and in which ways, in a sense? So these are some questions that we might answer later.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Moritz not only for inviting me to read his book and to speak here, but also for writing the book in the first place, which I have read with great pleasure, and I hope you will read with great pleasure afterwards. I think it's a very timely book. We do live in a time in which increasing attention is paid to personal freedom as a perhaps contested but still quite central characteristic of what we think of as European and American society. And it takes now a very central place in what is commonly called the culture wars, right? There are these different takes on what we think personal freedom is and how important it is to us. You already mentioned the freedom to drive at whatever speed one wishes on the highway. I mean, that is one way of thinking about freedom. Others in the room might have different ideas on what freedom represents to them. And I think, as some of us have already mentioned here, what you take is a fairly atypical approach to what is effectively a social history. I think most social histories tend to sort of take a number of very concrete, specific historical events and gather empirical material, and then connect that up to a sort of theoretical level of abstraction. What you intriguingly has done is take this very abstract and theoretical idea and turned it into something very specific and empirical and personal, and so really sort of narrow it down to something that indeed ordinary people say and do and sort of play with, sometimes with a high ambitious sort of theoretical level, but sometimes also in a very pedestrian kind of way, which I thought was very interesting. What I enjoyed the most, and what is obviously quite central to the book, is that you are looking for freedom where one wouldn't necessarily expect it. And in the book, you define this as looking for freedom is in adverse contexts, and you describe looking for freedom in times of war, and particularly mass war, for example, under authoritarianism, whether communist or fascist, in collectivist societies, during times of conscription, for example, so all these places where it's genuinely quite difficult to find freedom. And you conclude in the end that it's not these heroic freedoms that have won out, but it's an unheroic version of freedom that has sort of taken the lead in the 20th century. But I would say that this is perhaps the strength of the book, this sort of, looking for freedom not only in adverse places, but also simply in unlikely contexts, right? And so what I would like to focus on, and what sort of drew my attention the most, are these sort of more sort of pedestrian, unlikely contexts. And so, Moritz, and I didn't think I would ever say this to a colleague, but I would like to talk to you about DIY, shopping, and jazz. These are the sort of, unheroic contexts in which I think, there are many things to say about freedom, and you do say some of them, but I do wonder if you could expand on them in terms of the kind of ambitions they perhaps hide, as well, in terms of their sort of domestic pedestrian capacity. So for those of you who haven't read the book yet and who would like to know everything about DIY and jazz and shopping, I will say a little bit, and then you have to read the book to find out more. But so one of the things you draw attention to is sort of the capacity of the domestic sphere, and particularly the nuclear family in the 20th century, as this sort of unlikely context for the development of personal freedom, not only for men, but also for women, and to some degree, perhaps even for children. One of the ways in which that is made possible is that the home, particularly after the Second World War, I would say, becomes this place for example, the development of a personal style. And that even happens in collectivist context. You describe the dacha as this place where people sort of, gather a world of their own within a communist context in which they can sort of think about their own preferences in terms of style, and that is perhaps to a large degree a woman's affair. But then you also, of course, write about these men after the 1950s who increasingly take charge of space in a very literal way in building their own cupboards. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who grew up amidst the results of, the questionable kind of success people might have with these kind of projects. And of course, the domestic sphere also tells us quite a bit about where women can claim some level of personal freedom, even though domestic work is one of the places where women very often lack freedom, right? So these kind of tensions between, on the one hand, being hampered in one's ability to develop oneself, and then by the same token, that's creating sort of limited space in order to have a personal freedom that indeed sits very closely to, as Willemijn already said, to this notion of the development of an individual self, in a sense, right? And you stress this quite a lot, I would say. So that is one thing that I would like to hear more about. Another one is indeed shopping as an aspect of freedom, and particularly consumption as this sort of place in which freedom at an individual level can be experienced at an almost sensuous level, as, this sort of very sort of ontological or even sort of what is often called lived experience, right? Kind of way of experiencing freedom. There's a critique of this, which you talk about in the book at quite some length in terms of, part of this sort of consumption society that exists, again, post the Second World War, also consists of the manipulation of the masses through, for example, advertising. But by the same token, there is a sort of close connection between the impression of the capitalist West as the free world and the sort of freedom that is afforded by shopping, and then also the rise of popular culture and particularly youth culture as a sort of first attempt to, for example, give young people a notion of individual freedom. And then finally, perhaps my favorite subject, but that tells you all more about me than it does about the book, is this sort of notion of jazz as almost a sonification of freedom, in which you sort of suggest that the freedom is already inherent in the musical style. You know, there's a freedom from these various stylistic conventions of classical music, and there's an enormous role for improvisation in jazz. I would perhaps counter that jazz has quite a lot of stylistic conventions as well that are quite difficult to master. And by the same token, jazz also creates room for specific and particularly minoritized groups of musicians to sort of claim a space of their own, and particularly for those who come perhaps from social backgrounds that otherwise would not have been given access to concert halls, to gain, you know, an enormous influence in the sphere of music, but also socially. And it is precisely, I think, in these kind of unlikely, indeed unheroic places of the home, the dacha, the DIY project, or indeed the jazz piano, that the recognition of freedom also illuminates this even larger theme of the modern self, which you do seem to equate with personal freedom, individual self. The book also lays bare, I think, who was allowed freedom, or whose freedom was considered legitimate freedom. And at the same time, that also means that we get to see whose relative lack of freedom was needed to underpin the classic liberties that we tend to associate with Western liberalism. And I think, for example, of women's domestic labor, that really underpins quite a lot of men's development of freedom throughout the 20th century. I'm thinking also of colonial extraction as, you know, a practice that really underpinned Western freedom. We can also think, indeed, of all the unfreedoms that led to various blonde, blue-eyed men in Germany to, you know, expand their freedom quite extensively in the 30s, for example. And I think what your book makes quite clear is that it's not simply a black page in a history of glorious progress, but rather that this is constitutive of modern individual freedom in the way that we tend to still, I think, glorify it to this day. Now, again, for those of you who haven't read it yet, the book ends also with a reflection on these neoliberal claims that they are one of the last bastions of freedom, and particularly of the freedom of speech. What I think this book also gives us is clear reasons to question such claims, and it encourages us to once again look for freedom in unlikely places, and perhaps not in terms of, you know, the ability to drive as fast as we want or to say whatever we want. I'll leave it there. I'm curious to hear what else you have to tell us.
So thank you very much. You already decided, of course, to buy the book. Well, you can order it over there. You have to ask the people of Spui 25, and then they will send the book to you later. Moritz, there are a lot of questions about the development of individuality and the self, for example.
Yes, thanks very much to both of you. I'll try to reply to some of your points. I'm afraid I won't, otherwise I would be going on for the next 2 hours. And I don't think that would be in anyone's interest. Maybe on the question of definition, I think modern individuality has actually more dimensions. It can mean a claim to be free of something. It can also mean a claim to be catered for individually. Don't treat me as a number, treat me as a person. Take my personal situation into account. A tension that, for instance, the welfare state is very strongly confronted by. It requires standardization. It can't treat people in the same situation differently because that would be unequal. But at the same time, people say, I don't want to be treated in a bureaucratic fashion. So that, I think, would be a whole kind of the state and how it interacts as individuality would, you know, yield a different book. And also, would I like to see more work? I think, yes, absolutely. Not necessarily on freedom, but also on these other dimensions of individuality, because it's one key dimension of modernity. And that's not new. That's what one of the founding fathers, several actually, Durkheim, Simmel, Weber, in a way, already around 1900 of modern sociology, sort of suggested. And yet we don't have the same. We have studies here and there, but we don't have this anywhere near the same density of studies that we have, for instance, on urbanization or on industrialization, industrial revolution, in sort of key long-standing debates, lots of more detailed research. And just one example of when I sort of started to interact via this book with more colleagues who come from different fields, a British historian, Helen McCarthy, who's now wrote me that I sent her some chapters, she wrote to me that she's now working on retirement. That's actually age is something I have little on use, but not freedom in old age. Is really a gap in my book. And she has said, how do British pensioners understand their freedom? They're free from something, work constraints, obviously, but are they also free to do something that they always wanted? What about, the grandchildren? Are they perhaps impeding on their freedom? That's depending on how you look at it. So I think I'd definitely like to have more dialogues and simply read more sort of on different aspects. And also, I think with the explicitly expressed versus implicit practices. So I have some implicit practices. For instance, these people in camps in Franco Spain, in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, who were obviously, not in a position to articulate any claim, but still try to carve out a tiny space for themselves. That's more an implicit practice, but I think very often, so I was asking myself in terms of also consumption, is wearing a pair of blue jeans, is that an expression of freedom? And I think when it's become very kind of taken for granted, like in the Netherlands, to wear blue jeans, then I see it less than when it's something that, like teenagers in the 1950s, had to face parental disapproval or worse for that. Then it was an expression of freedom. There are many great books I read, but there's an entire monograph on the blue jeans in 1960s Hungary, where it sort of represented a sort of freedom. And the relatively lenient communist regime in Hungary then produced a pair of blue jeans that they called the trapper blue jeans, because a trapper had some vague American West association, and that was much better than the jeans in the Soviet Union, but it didn't match a pair of Levi's. And that wasn't just quality, it was, of course, perhaps that too, but it was, of course, the symbolic kind of value that conferred on those teenagers or 20-something that, were managed to secure access to a pair of Levi's. So I think that's often context dependent. Does something still count as freedom or not? And maybe Dror Worman, so to see modern self. I think a lot of this literature is relevant in some respect. So I'm not saying, of course, there are Foucault, there are certain instances, there's a whole dimension where, individuality is forced on sectors of society, for instance, property of land, as opposed to communal land. So I'm not saying this is just doesn't capture the entire picture. And with Dror Worman, I think what sort of really one notion is that freedom is dependent on a cohesive, autonomous self. And then I had this kind of section on called expanding the ego on those who saw that as a limitation. And, think of avant-garde artists, for instance, or drug consumers, who were kind of bent on expanding their emotional, mental horizons. And in terms of jazz, sort of, there's always this book you come across and had I known about this, I should have included that too. And it's actually, I think, an autobiography or biography, I can't quite remember, by a Swiss free jazz piano player, a woman by the name of Irene Schweitzer, that definitely has freedom in the title. So that would be very interesting, what freedom meant for, after all, strongly male-dominated musical sector, jazz, as a free jazz playing woman. So what did freedom mean for her? So I think that would take it further. And maybe just a final remark on colonialism. I think that's a sort of a very key divide, to claim freedom for Europeans and deny it to non-Europeans. And that's also something that the settlers often said, in French Algeria, for instance, said quite explicitly. So we are free, independent, we work our land. They tended to omit the inconvenient fact that they were depending on African, in that case, labor, and on a state that was able to come in and, and defend them when necessary. And then on the other side of society, we see among anti-colonial intellectuals, I see some claims that we are also individuals. Why shouldn't we be free individuals? But also a certain, upon realizing that they were kind of perennially denied the fulfillment of that claim, it turned towards different notions. I think you can see that with African versions of socialism, with Gandhiism, in a sense, alternative to that, because we anyway not getting that, so we would develop something of our own. That's very brief, just in response to at least some of the points you raised.
Yeah, Moritz, you write a lot about contradictions and social dependencies, and you don't want to have one narrative of progress of freedom in the 20th century. But still, you might ask, if you read your book, there are some developments like what you write about expanding the ego. Consumerism plays a much more important role. Freedom at the work floor is also an important issue, which I think expands or grows, and it makes the work-life balance easier, so to speak. Jazz, but there is a sort of musical awareness and freedom to listen to the music you like. Aren't these all examples of history of progress? Or I think I know the answer, but I just want to ask you the question.
I call it conflict-ridden expansion. Yeah. So there are these contradictions. There are always doubts. For instance, expanding the ego, is that a good thing? Is there certain things that at some point, began to appear hugely problematic, because they were in the 70s quite openly. Probably here in the Netherlands, people are quite familiar with that. There were people who said it's a natural expansion of freedom to engage in sexual relations with underage people. And that children's freedom is quite not served by that. And then at some point, there was an realization this is hugely problematic to sort of suggest that 10-year-olds kind of engage in sexual relations with adults of their own volition, that it's freedom for them. So that's one of the things where it's a conflict-ridden expansion, and where an expansion, for instance, can seem like, freedom is broadened, made available to more people. What's wrong about that? And suddenly, there's a realization of a problem. Or there's an ongoing ambivalence with consumerism. That's very classic in all these debates on America. Is that really freedom, or are people there so manipulated by advertisements and consumer society that they're fundamentally unfree? So that's something that, in a sense, also very much in the eye of the beholder. You can see these things either way, and it's probably not necessarily my role to adjudicate kind of normatively between these different views.
In a way, you said it already, it's an unheroic history, but I'm very interested if you have affinities to certain people you describe or analyze, if there are heroes in your book.
Yeah, many.
Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah, so, okay, what sort of... let's stick to Aristotle. There's so many people in the book that make appearances, often very brief ones. But what's sort of interesting, I've read her books as a child, but it's not like I was hugely preoccupied with them as an adult. I think it's also, and ties in with the point on inclusivity, because I think sort of with sort of diversity of perspective, I think one issue I have with a lot of these debates is often presented as a limitation. So we can no longer cite these authors, apparently. And I felt hugely, my own horizon, hugely expanded by just said, okay, try to achieve a certain balance. People from different parts of Europe, women, one gay person, and then because it makes you think beyond your comfort zone. Don't just go with the first example that comes to your mind, which in my case would often be German, and sort of don't always go, so think further. And who might you find who's Swedish? If you have 15 of these sections that to introduce, who do you have a Scandinavian? And at some point, these ideas came up, kind of, why not Astrid Lindgren? Okay, read a bit, of course, to see whether it even fits. And sometimes I also dropped these options. But with Astrid Lindgren, the interesting thing is I used her for a section that I called After Liberation. So what happens when people already feel free? They already feel liberated. Is that good? Or does it come with lots of new ambiguities? And Astrid Lindgren actually felt as a jazz gal of the 1920s, and with relatively lenient parents, certainly by the standards of the 1920s, she already felt free at an early age. She was sort of pregnant she started out early, practically at 17 as a journalist, and I think 1 or 2 later she fell pregnant by the editor-in-chief who wanted to marry her. He wanted to leave his wife, found a family. Astrid Lindgren was very clear about, no, I don't want that. And you're paying child support, which was not an easy thing to even kind of secure at that point. So it's often a difficult thing to secure in this day and age, but certainly in the 1920s. But that came with hardship as well, because she gave away the son to a foster family in Copenhagen, not in her own country, quite didn't see him that often, and she often wrote about loneliness as a price of being liberated. So I thought people who were really kind of, and of course not everyone could be as explicit, who were in a sense pursuing a certain version of individual freedom, but also, being quite honest about the ambivalences that come with that. I think those are people I often have a lot of sympathy for, including, but many others too.
Free to ask. Free? Yeah, free to ask. Yeah, what I also really want to know, in the title is The Quest for Individual Freedom, a 20th century European history. What is specifically European in your history, other than American or African or Asian?
Yeah, I think I would need to read more work on freedom. I read some in different cultural contexts. There's very kind of, sometimes you see, there's this historian in Britain whose name now eludes me, who wrote about notions of freedom in Africa. And there are some similar complaints. There are, for instance, conservative complaints in African society sometime mid-century that, I think Tanzania or something, that, the young are only interested in Western styles of consumption, don't respect the elders anymore. So I think Europeans, essentially, is that a European influence? Partly it is, and partly it's, the historian showing that in the 1950s, Western style European fashion became a sign, music for that matter, jazz sometimes, became a sort of a way of, trying to be free in the context of a non-European society. And then there are, there's of course the perennial sort of engagement with America once it became clear that America is, probably one of the two dominant societies of the 1920s. It's no longer Europe. Is that free or not free? And I think also, there's a book called The Story of American Freedom by Eric Foner. It's been published in the late 1990s. It was also remarkably, it's not one linear story, it's different versions of freedom, it's conservative libertarians, it's hippies, it's the civil rights movement, so it's all kinds of it. I would say fundamentally, some of these fundamental ambivalences you can probably also see in other societies, But I'm curious to read more, and if at all possible, engage with those who are interested in similar questions who do the history of Japan. I think the one thing I took away already a while ago was that there are quite a few historians who say there are notions maybe of not necessarily of individual freedom, but of individuality in other societies. So to say in India or Japan there is no notion of the individual, that's apparently a cliche. That's at least what certain anthropologists and sociologists argue, in my view, quite convincingly, just saying these notions of individuality are different. And of course, they have their own context, they have their own language, but to say there is no individual in Japan or so is apparently, just doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. So that's at least a strong argument. I have sort of a takeaway that I had, but that's based on. And in a sense, I wouldn't have the confidence to write a global history of individuality myself, because I can, get into colonialism a bit and tried hard to do that, but there are limitations to what I can usefully and, with a reasonable degree, it's anyway a broad book, kind of cover and have a feeling that this is about right or at least defensible, and I wouldn't have that confidence, for global history of individual freedom.
Yeah, I want to maybe pick up on this notion of European individualism a bit more, and I wonder at times in the book, particularly when you write about women, is where does the individual end and the nuclear family begin? Because I think in many ways they're very closely related, certainly for the second half of the century. And I was reminded of Emma Griffin's book on the breadwinner. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. And so she has done some lots of social history, but particularly of young women working in the Lancashire textile industry. And there she very clearly described that certainly for young women, founding one's own family was seen as leading to more freedom than working for oneself as a single woman, even though you would expect it intuitively to work the other way around, because that gave you more of a sort of agency over your own life. You were no longer under the control of your parents. And so motherhood was a sort of a more free, or perhaps even a more individual sense to have as a woman than being on your own, intriguingly. So I was sort of wondering how that fits into your concept of individual freedom, especially also when you then apply it to children, for example, or to older people, those who no longer really fit those molds of independent kind of decision-making that we tend to associate with freedom.
Yes, maybe I start by saying a bit more on theory, because that was always also something you probed me sort of for, and sort of various authors who were conceptually influential for me are actually sociologists. And one of these sort of three classics, Simmel, Weber, Durkheim, around 1900, sort of the one that's closest to my preoccupations, is Georg Simmel. And Simmel actually already around 1900, his philosophy of money, he wrote that, it's important, freedom is not just an objective thing, it's also subjective, what people understand by it. And that is often a matter of degrees. So it's not about are you fundamentally free or are you not free. Sometimes it can be that stark, but very often freedom is about degrees. And that's really an idea that really resonates with what I was trying to do. And I think women in factories, in art, that's a matter of degree. So they have this quotation of in one of these books on the British working class on a woman who later recalled how as a maid who was always expected to prepare breakfast, she looked out of the window and saw the girls coming out of the factory at 6 waiting for the bus, and then she was there then off work. At 6 they're out of there, they can do their own thing. And I used to think these girls or young women were completely free. Because from her maid's perspective, looking out of the window before the next do this, that, and the other, make a cup of tea at 9 in the evening, from their perspective, that was an enormous gain in freedom. And the same was, freedom often meant freedom from your parents. And, at a time when it's very difficult to carve, well nigh impossible at times to carve out a legitimate space as a young single woman, it could mean that marriage was definitely an advance. And is factory work sort of unfree? Most of us, would probably experience that way. But if you are in Sicily in the 1950s and you have to do everything a rich landowner expects of you because unemployment is so high, you have to be, humiliatingly dependent. Then there's a reason why you might want to migrate to the north of Italy or further to other parts of Europe and do an unskilled factory job, because relatively speaking, that really enhances freedom. So freedom as a matter of degrees, I think, so I don't want to go into all the sociological stuff I read. It's also different authors who say different things, but I think that's quite a fundamental idea, to maybe a takeaway.
For the European perspective, I think it's good to have some more concrete questions. And if you want to ask something, you're very welcome. But until nobody is... Oh, there are many questions already, so I think we better go to the public, or... Yeah? Okay. We have a question there.
Moritz, thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for your eloquent discussion about freedom. My question is, you noted that we cannot take freedom for granted anymore. But as Western Europeans, are we willing to defend our freedom in today's time and age? Not only our individual freedom, but also our collective freedom.
Yeah, I'd quite like to know the answer to that myself, I must say. Yeah, I can't really probably historians, it's a situation that, of freedom being under threat, that, in many ways we struggle. Partly we were so spoiled by the outcome, the end of the Cold War, who we haven't really thought about a lot. And certain things that we took for granted, think of, now conference travel to the United States, to take a very kind of topical example, are perhaps now no longer taken for granted. So it's also in a way, people who organize conferences on African history kind of point out quite rightly, we've had problems with our conferences trying to get African colleagues to the UK, for instance, for many years. And that they don't mean saying that, that makes it okay, but it also means that, we are forced to reflect on things we have been taken for granted have taken for granted for a long time. And that are no longer guaranteed in any way. So yeah, whether we're able to collectively to defend what that even means, so I'm afraid that's for other people than historians to answer. But I'm curious myself. It's a very good question and something I'm pondering a lot. Yeah, I think it's sort of also, we tend to see immediate threats. And we tend to realize that that's certainly something but you can also see it as a limitation, much as you can sort of maybe admire lots of people who make appearances here. It's also a limitation. People feel a restriction, a threat, and they tend to feel when it's, disconcertingly close. But it's very hard to sort of deal with threats to freedom that are abstract. For instance, I think also, are you free when you are in a free profession? Let's say you're a lawyer, you have lots of money and the freedom that comes with that, and you are a homeowner in the south of France, but then there's a forest fire. And then that's really something that, the danger has been around, has been described for decades, but now many of these things become quite uncomfortably realistic and palpable. And so the answer is, I'm afraid, has to be left to history.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really very kind of sets my mind in activity mode in a very nice way, your discussion and your presentation. I think, I hope like simple questions, short questions, and the first one relates already. I mean, freedom is an idea. It's also an experience. It's related to feelings, so which came up a lot. And I guess my question would be, could you elaborate on that a bit more? Because, I mean, you talked about Astrid Lindgren feeling free, also lonely. And I would think, there are other feelings, subjective experience that come to mind, like being content, being happy, right? The famous pursuit of happiness that haven't come up so far. So I would just be curious in what role do feelings play? What kind of feelings come up in what ways? And can you say a bit more about that? And then just maybe very spontaneously, because you brought it up just now, which, hinting at climate change, hinting at nature. And I recently visited Australia for the first time, and obviously there's a lot going on with, reckoning with and integrating Aboriginal culture and, the people themselves. And everything that you were able to see about that is always about starting with the dependence on nature, right? So in a way, that's a completely different approach, but and it somehow points to maybe a sort of blind spot, maybe, I don't know, but where in a way now it becomes sort of very different kind of, maybe like an act of freedom to emphasize limitation that will not go away, and that in that sense, in the culture of freedom, there's a kind of there might be a mythic element. That's too complicated. But I just would be interested if you could say more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I was thinking at some point, should I have said something about the environment and nature and how individual freedom relates to that? And there's now in Germany, there's a philosopher, I think she also had appearances here, and she was featured in the Groene Amsterdammer by the name of Eva van Redeker. And her book is called Bleibefreiheit, which means bleib is to stay, the freedom to stay. Freedom, her argument is that freedom is often associated with mobility, car driver, but is a freedom to stay where you are rather than having to become a climate refugee, isn't that something to cherish? And I think it's an excellent sort of take on freedom, and really, but my sort of defense for not including it is it's not a very 20th century question. Because in 20th century, one key problem is what I was thinking back, sort of in a German context, there were two kind of backlashes against green proposals in the 1990s. One was to tax petrol very highly, 5 mark per liter, and one was to ration flights to Mallorca. So those were backbenchers, Greens, and the backlash was such, even among potential Green voters at the time, that was, maybe 10%. The backlash was even among those. You could say, the rest is not going to vote for us anyway. That actually the Greens never suggested anything like that. So I think this sort of, it's also a limitation that this emphasis we and, many millions of Europeans tend to place, and elsewhere in the world tend to place on individual freedom, made serious thinking, and not just thinking, but draw consequences of that thinking about the environments very difficult, and continues to make it very difficult. I think that's sort of certainly something that, if you take it sort of, take a bird's eye view of the whole thing, that's certainly a limitation, but I would say it's a 20th century limitation. It's not, some people, you always find some environmentalists who probably have argued that our freedom is at stake if we don't rethink our relationship to nature, but those were not very consequential, I'm afraid, not very consequential proposals. As to the emotion, I think it's a huge range, because, going back to the domestic sphere, it's quiet contentment often. If people really felt that, having more choices in the domestic sphere, more free time, then they could experience that as such, like, needlework with different patterns, but also, often the male equivalent, the gardening. You could experience that as freedom. You could also see it as an other onerous obligation. Now I have to do the gardening on top of my paid work, and it's somehow a cultural expectation that seems hard to avoid. That's all, again, in the eye of the beholder. And there's also kind of sudden euphoric liberation. 1968, of course, you also often have that in the Russian Revolution before. This feeling of suddenly the factory discipline breaks down. And often you have accounts, you have that in 1980 and you have it again in 1968, of people just dancing in their factory because, the foreman didn't have authority anymore. So they were just dancing, and then, of course, what happens after that momentous liberation? Is it really working towards workplace autonomy, or does it mean returning to the work much the same as people did before, but securing higher wages in that? And that's a tension you have, for instance, in France after 1968. So again, sort of, I think, very different emotional states. There can be kind of euphoric states, sadness, quiet contentment, or simply missing freedom a lot for the people who were the most deprived of it.
I haven't read your book, so maybe you talk about this in the book itself. But I was wondering, with the subtitle 20th Century European History, you locate yourself, willingly or not, in a really large body of literature that try to analyze the 20th century in European history. And recently, or in the last few decades, specifically beyond the focus of on these big breaks, right? 1918, 1945, 1989. For example, I'm thinking of the book Geborstene Zeit by Michael Wild recently, right? Geborstene Zeit by Michael Wild. It's kind of attempts to find narratives beyond the grand narratives, but also a little bit grand narratives. And I was just wondering how you locate your effort. Is this also specifically trying to look at continuities rather than the breaks, or is it actually, or how does it relate to these big breaks, the concept of individual freedom?
Yes, thank you. Yes, it was a sort of meant a bit sort of both ways, the subtitle. It's a 20th century European history of the quest for individual freedom, but it's also a perspective, almost a bit more confidently, a perspective on how you can interpret 20th century Europe as a whole. If you, of course, also have read a chronological survey, so it doesn't replace these more chronological, more classical books, but I think it's sort of also one of these attempts to, several attempts, previous attempts to kind of write about much of 20th century Europe from one particular perspective. Liz Büttner's is here on post-colonialism and the transition of decolonization in the perspective of European societies. There are also books on, for instance, the influence of America, and there's a synthetic book on sexuality in 20th century Europe by Dagmar Herzog. So I would sort of try to place myself among these attempts, and yes, of course, cross a lot of chronological boundaries, but also emphasize, and that's perhaps a more conventional, people have done that before, of course, emphasize a sort of post-1950s, 60s turn. I think it's not a term, then people discovered how important individuality is, because I think that's more of a continuity that kind of runs across the chronological divides, but then it's really where these more mundane kind of everyday notions of individual freedom kind of become more accepted, more widespread, or maybe widespread as a quest, they had been widespread before, but become more accommodated by political and moral regimes. The Catholic Church, the Communist Party, even Franco in the 60s loosens up a lot and compared to the 1940s and 50s. So I think that's maybe not the most original point, but that's definitely a big change I'd like to emphasize alongside a lot of continuities.
Well, I have read the book, and I thought that these big events, so to say, in 20th century European histories are very important. The First World War, you described that there is a development which was unexpected, that women became much more important at the workshop floor, that they, of course, become much more important in politics. They emancipate themselves. It's more or less a success after the First World War, whereas the socialists' strive for freedom has a lot of constraints. The revolutions of 1918 are not successful, and the Social Democrats have problems with these revolutions and their own credibility. So this quest for freedom after the First World War is totally different than after the Second World War, because the Second World War plays a much more important role in your book, I think, than the First World War, particularly the longing for liberation in the occupied territories by Germany occupied, plays also a very important role. The concentration camps and all these atrocities play a very important role in your book, and particularly in a longer history after 1945, I would say. And the same you can say for 1989, because you also make a big distinction between the Cold War and the period after the Cold War. That's what I would say as a reader.
Yes, I think sort of the wars are, very unexpected because most people didn't anticipate the war. Most people didn't anticipate the extent of the Second World War either. Maybe that it would happen sooner or later. It's again it goes back to the point on the threat not being that immediately felt before it actually hits you. Yes, fundamentally, there's a capacity to adapt to these situations. There's a capacity to carve out a space, a human capacity to carve out a space. These stories of First World War kind of soldiers who do a bit of early photography in the trenches or draw something, or the more educated write a diary, or sometimes not so educated write a diary. So they carve out a little space for themselves, and you even have that in concentration camps. And you also have that under German occupation. But it's also in these situations fundamentally, of course, a hope to be liberated from all this, to no longer have to be in the trenches, to no longer have to live under the occupation of Nazi Germany. And then it's also the question is, after the wars, does it sort of really sustain a political transformation, or is it again more kind of short-lived enthusiasm, a kind of feeling of liberation that's celebrated, but that's sort of hard to channel into a political transformation? That's always the kind of challenge of after the war. There's a lot to do. After both wars, there's a lot of kind of left-wing disappointment, because of course, and there's actually in the German case, in 1918, I've written on that previously, there's also a real sort of a disgruntlement of left-wingers to the left of social democracy who say, it's just not, the Germans don't have it in them. They're undisciplined, so they kind of celebrate a bit, and then they go back to normal. How can you do a revolution with these people? Then there's sort of the Lenin envy, kind of Lenin sort of nearly nailed it with his approach in Russia, and we sort of have neither a Lenin, we lack a leader, but we also don't have the revolutionary subjectivity in ourselves. And I would say similarly with some anti-fascists after the Second World War, there's a similar kind of potential for disappointment. You want a wide-reaching transformation of, say, French society, but then you see, okay, not enough people are on board with that. And some are even of the view that the collaborators are kind of okay again. And basically, after a couple of years, it wears off, this anti-fascist enthusiasm. In Italy, France, you have that experience. So, and again, sort of going also back to the point on dictatorships loosening up in the 1960s, and that actually really raises the issue of, can one be free under dictatorship? And that's, of course, can one be free just because, you know, you have a bit more time for yourself on the weekend, consumption opportunities, domestic sphere, the dacha. And that's a problem of dissidents, that they often say, quite bitter things about their compatriots, that they say a lot of people, you know, they don't see that they're unfree. Well, sort of what do we do with these people? They can't realize they seem to be reasonably happy. They don't see that it's not a free life under dictatorships. And dissidents in Franco Spain and dissidents in, say, Czechoslovakia say quite similar things about being, you know, what if people accept that as freedom? And then they also, of course, then these regimes end, but then often the transformation is not going the way the dissidents wanted. The dissidents are very ambitious in what they is a moral kind of commitment they expect of people, and it's prone to disappointment.
Yeah, very briefly, tying in with this, it might be good to say that your book is structured along 5 themes. I think morality, war, colonies, etc., which is quite a brave choice in a sense, because it immediately implies that there's not a big distinction between Western and Eastern. Oh, but you probably can hear me. No? Okay. Should I repeat it? Okay. So, I mean, that choice of these 5 themes and a thematic approach rather than, say, chapters on Eastern or Western Europe separately, or on before or after the Second World War, that's a very specific choice, right? And it kind of, maybe you could briefly say something about, have you considered alternatives? And then I think there might be another question.
Yeah, thanks. That's sort of the part I can't really remember, because I can recall that sort of vagueness. I don't quite know how to approach the book, and for years I wrote a whole book in between, because I said I was suddenly invited to write a book on something different, culture in the Third Reich, and then I thought, okay, I wanted to get on with this other book. But if I'm really honest, I don't have a plan, so I might as well say yes to that other project. And then, did I, from that point, consider an alternative? I think I really wanted these kind of dimensions that cross chronological and geographical boundaries, because I think it leads you to consider similarities. For instance, these sort of several times, also with the camps, I had sort of Spain, Soviet Union, kind of Eastern Germany and other communist countries, similarities, and you start to see these more when you don't adopt a country by country or region of Europe by region of Europe or chronological sort of some approach. So that, I mean, war, the chapters on war, obviously that's Second and the First World War in these chapters. The aftermath, that has it because that's simply so all-encompassing in a way that this really requires chapters that are, you know, recognizably linked to these wars, but others are not, because sometimes, although the time rhythm is different, there are these kind of interruptions of normal life, and it turns out they're more than they go on for years, and then there are also these more steady, kind of more gradual developments.
I have the impression that, despite the fact that you say you didn't have a very clear plan, that the book has a very clear message, in the sense that there is not just a quest for individual freedom, but in fact an expansion of individual freedom, and that you can write this history of individual freedom as a series of attempts to overcome the limitations to freedom, which sounds to me very much like a sort of maybe somewhat old-fashioned progressive history. While I think you would be able to write the history of freedom in Europe also in the 20th century from a very different perspective, namely the struggle against individual freedom, not just the limitations that you, of course, have in the state, in the market, etc., but basically the suspicion and fear of individual freedom in the form of license, consumerism, neoliberal fantasies, all kinds of ways in which people are very suspicious about about especially individual freedom, and on the contrary, propose very much different notions of freedom, namely positive, collective, national, racial, class notions of freedom that are in a way proposed as not just an alternative, but as the actual form of freedom, or the way that freedom should be analyzed. So how come you had this plan of writing the old progressive story?
Well, yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. It's sort of, you know, with all the qualifications, the caveats, the ambiguities, it could still be a progressive story, even with ones that with hiccups and sort of uneven developments along the way. I think what I'm interested in, if you think of these alternative visions of really that sometimes they can be, of course, they can be anti-individual freedom. They can be, say, we have a notion of freedom, but we have it for a collective, a class, a nation. But if you look closely, they often have an element of an element. Not saying that explains the entire ideology or regime, but they have an element of individual freedom in them. Because sometimes when I talk about the Third Reich, so sometimes people say, but what about you're nothing, your folk is everything? And I was like, yeah, that's quite a frequent slogan, but hardly ever any one of these high-ranking Nazis ever says, I'm nothing and my folk is everything. So they were actually a bunch of egotists. And that, you know, worked, sort of felt liberated from ethical constraints. And they saw that as a liberation that we have to take seriously. And then there's also that they have to accommodate this quest, even if they don't like it very much. For instance, the communists in the Eastern Bloc have to acknowledge people want decent housing, and if they all get impatient, we have a problem. We can't oppress the entire working class. We can oppress large sectors of society, but not the entire working class. When they rise up, as they did in East Berlin, other parts of East Germany in 1953, Poznan 56, and so forth, we have a problem. So the Soviet Union starts, you know, the great kind of largest housing program in European history in the 60s, because they realized that this kind of Stalinist emphasis on happily sacrificing you for the greater good is sort of not attractive enough to not a lot of people. And Stakhanovism is a way of saying you're sort of out of your own volition, you know, kind of work 300% more or something than you have to, and we celebrate that, but not everyone is able to do that or very keen on doing that. So in a sense, I think they compromise with that quest, and they have to, in the long run, to sustain themselves. And then, of course, they obviously, in this tension, they don't want to have too much of it. You know, the freedom, they don't want to have Stalinist camps on that scale anymore, but they don't want to, you know, acknowledge or grant freedom of opinion either. So they try to muddle through. And that I find quite interesting, how they actually try to, different polities actually try to somehow, sometimes uncomfortably, willingly, nillingly, try to sort of incorporate and accommodate that quest. That's a perspective that interests me, but of course not the only perspective from which to look at these regimes.
I didn't read it as a progressive history. Perhaps I suggested it a little bit in my questions to Moritz. I just want to advise you all, buy the book. It's a great book. It's a good read. I said it already. You can order it at the back, and we want to thank Moritz for
it's also a bit cheaper than a lot of other Cambridge University Press books.
That as well. And I hope you have a good and free evening.